We briefly reviewed how we came to this study, how for 14 months we've been presenting understandings of World War II and the Fourth Diadochi War in connection with that. So really we're completing our study into World War I and the Third Diadochi War, showing how that conflict really first originates and develops. We spoke of that history of the counterfeit, 1899 to 1945. At every step, we're employing our methodology. At every step, we're employing parable methodology, I should say. And as we compare and contrast 1899 and 1945, that 46-year history, and we compare and contrast that with Millerite history, we're able to form a number of conclusions. One of the ones that I didn't remind us of this morning is that when we come to 1798 to 1844, you have the first and the second angels' messages. In this history, the First and the Second World Wars. And when we take Millerite history into our own, what do we do with the first and the second angels' messages? They overlap, they combine. That's something we've taught for many years, that there's a combination. Whereas in Millerite history you have the first and then you have the second. In our time, there's a combination work going on and they overlap. You find the arrival of the second at the empowerment of the first. And you see this overlap in our reform line. So when you take the world wars, the First and the Second World War, and you see them repeat in our time, what should you expect to see? The same thing, an overlap. It's just another thing to have in our minds as we make application. Every step of the history and then the application that we're making is built upon our rules of parable methodology. So we'd gone into the history of the Third Diadochi War. We'd seen the rise of Antigonus as he defeated Eumenes, really the two superpowers of Alexander's empire at that time. We see the defeat of Eumenes through treachery. We see Antigonus having these two allies, Seleucus and Python. We see Python becoming more and more powerful until Antigonus, feeling threatened by him, has him killed. We see Seleucus turning from his alliance to Antigonus, seeing that Antigonus is starting to act dictatorially. He flees from Antigonus and joins those other generals and and those generals start to come into an alliance to warn each other of Antigonus's behaviour and to work more closely together. They form an alliance and they send Antigonus an ultimatum. They tell him to stop acting like such a dictator, stop acting unilaterally, to start spreading out his power and also what he'd won through those wars. He refuses to do that, and instead he goes to war against the three allies, particularly against Ptolemy, who he's had long-standing conflict with. And he invades Ptolemy's sphere of influence, particularly Colsyria and the surrounding territory of Colsyria. This develops, he takes control over all the territory down towards Egypt. He leaves that territory under the protection of his son Demetrius. He travels up to start facing Lysimachus and Cassander. Ptolemy comes out and faces Demetrius at Gaza, and they fight the famous Battle of Gaza. Demetrius fights against the advice of his generals, and he is destroyed. His army's largely destroyed. He flees north, meets up with his father, and then Antigonus starts to retake what he's lost. Retake all the territory back down through Colsyria to the very borders of Egypt. Because of the Battle of Gaza and Antigonus's defeat, Seleucus becomes hopeful, and he takes a portion of men from Ptolemy and he goes back and he takes back control of Babylon. Once Antigonus has taken all that territory down to the borders of Egypt, he starts to feel confident, starts to feel concerned, that he's under threat from the Nabateans, the people of those eastern tribes, and also he's heard that Seleucus has retaken Babylon, overthrown the puppet master that Antigonus had left in Babylon and taken over. So Antigonus concludes the peace of the dynasts, signs a peace treaty with Cassander, Lysimachus and Ptolemy, and this frees him up to fight against Seleucus over Babylon, which he does from 311 to 309 BC. He loses that war. Seleucus acts very strategically, and he loses Babylon to Antigonus, but then he retakes it. There's some going back and forth. In the end, he takes back Babylon, and the people of Babylon have, through this war, become so against Antigonus, they hate him. Antigonus surrenders, he gives up, and he goes back west. Seleucus has final control of Babylon, and at that point, we mark the beginning of the Seleucid dynasty. And then you have a period of peace before the Fourth Diadochi War begins. So that's the history of this Third Diadochi War with Antigonus and his son against the allies. We went from the Third Diadochi War, which we know is connected to the Fourth, to a discussion of World War I, which we know is connected to World War II. We started to break down the Bosnian crisis, and the reason I've made application at the same time is because of the complication of these histories. Usually we just lay out the full line and then make our application. But when we're dealing with the Bosnian crisis and the Gulf War, both are fairly complicated histories, and I wanted us to remember the key points and how they connect. We drew that up here when we saw in the Bosnian crisis, we saw Russia really as being the power behind Serbia, but Russia was weak in 1908 because they had internal issues, and they just lost a war with Japan. Serbia wants control of Bosnia, but Austria-Hungary takes control of Bosnia as a sphere of influence. Serbia then becomes angry at Austria-Hungary. This creates a tension and is one of the leading causes of World War I. We see Iraq, it was under the sphere of influence of the Soviet Union in that time, or Russia. Iraq wanted Kuwait, but the United States took it from them as a sphere of influence. And this tension between Iraq and the United States is really what developed into the future history. Russia, in this history of 89 to 91, the Soviet Union is dissolving, and it's not in a position to respond. It's too weak internally. So we compared and contrasted the Bosnian crisis with the Gulf War, making application simultaneously so we could remember the steps. Then we continued our history of World War I. The Bosnian crisis of 1908 upset many of the Slav nationalists, and some of those nationalists formed a terrorist organisation known as the Black Hand. They struck back against Austria-Hungary in Sarajevo on June 28 of 1914 with the assassination of the Archduke. This was not the cause of World War I, but it was the occasion that Austria-Hungary needed. Austria-Hungary sends Serbia an ultimatum that Serbia was never going to entirely fulfill. But Serbia fulfills most of it, enough of it that the rest of the relevant countries, thought that war had been averted. Instead, Austria-Hungary does not accept Serbia's attempts to fulfill the ultimatum, and July 28, 1 month to the day after the terrorist attack, Austria-Hungary invades Serbia and war is declared. Because of this, we see that much of those countries, then divided by the different alliances, it develops into what's known as the First World War or the First Global War because of those intricate alliances. And it wasn't just Austria and Hungary versus Serbia. As we know, France, Britain, Russia all entered into that war. And it became a war on two fronts, the Eastern Front and the Western Front. Russia declaring war on Austria-Hungary and Germany. So we have this war on two fronts. I want to focus on the Eastern Front. So Germany, Austria-Hungary, through this history, we know it has a symbology of a two-horned power, as does the United States. And in this history, we see Austria-Hungary begin to fall, Germany being the more powerful partner. Germany begins to come up with a plan to end the war on the Eastern Front. They know that many people within Russia are unhappy with the war. So they decide to capitalize on the internal divisions taking place within Russia. So over the course of this war, the conditions inside Russia are causing for society to become more and more polarized, and many people want out of the war. They're struggling economically, and there's these cracks occurring in Russian society that Germany decides they can use against Russia in the war. So I want to read some quotes here. Germany comes up with a plan, and their plan involves an exile that had been hiding out in Switzerland for at this point 10 years. That exile was Vladimir Lenin. Germany decides to take Lenin from Switzerland. Germany takes Lenin from a self-imposed 10-year exile in Switzerland. They put him on a train, a sealed train, and they post him back into Russia. Germany financed his Bolshevik party and his return to Germany, not because they believed in his theology, but because Lenin had said that if he was to take over the Russian government, he would take Russia out of World War I. Ludendorff said, "Lenin will overthrow the Russian patriots, and then I will strangle him and all of his friends." Despite the war, Germany permitted Lenin and other revolutionary exiles to enter back into Russia in a sealed train that travelled from Switzerland and through Germany. Because it was a sealed train, they didn't have to legally recognise that he had ever been through Germany. Then he was sent on a ferry to Sweden and a second train to Finland. They arrived in Petrograd in Finland. The next day, Lenin published his thesis that denounced the provisional government as well as the First World War. He said that the revolution was passing from the first stage to the second stage, and it began the 1917 revolution. As Lenin was in transit from Switzerland through Germany and through into Russia, as he arrived in Germany, there's documents that speak of this affair in Berlin's Historical Museum. One of those documents is a telegram that was sent by a German diplomat to Berlin that reads, "Lenin arrived safely in Russia. He's doing just what we wanted." So what Germany intends to do to end the war on the Eastern Front is to send Lenin into Russia to overthrow the government and remove Russia from the war. Lenin travels into Russia from March to, they call it the October Revolution. In our calendar it was November 8 of 1917. He overthrows the provisional government, takes control of Russia, begins the process of removing Russia from the First World War. He finally completes that task on March 3 of 1918. Sorry, I want to move. Okay. I'll just summarise that point. It's called the October Revolution, but they were still using the Julian calendar. It was November 8 by our calendar. November 8 of 1917. Lenin. And he was sent or aided by Germany. That plan of theirs is successful. And on March 3 of 1918, the new Bolshevik government signed a treaty with Germany known as the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. In the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, Lenin ended the war on the Eastern Front, but at a great loss to Russia. He lost his spheres of influence. He also lost much of their territory, people, and resources. By the terms of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, Russia recognized the independence of Ukraine, of Georgia, and of Finland, gave up Poland and the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia to Germany and Austria-Hungary, succeeded areas to Turkey. The total losses constituted some 1 million square miles of Russia's former territory, a third of its population of about 55 million people, a majority of its coal, oil, and iron stores, and much of its industry. Lenin bitterly called the settlement that abyss of defeat, dismemberment, enslavement, and humiliation. But it was necessary. So Germany sends Lenin in to overthrow the government. He completes that November 8 of 1917. March of the following year, he signs the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. He takes Russia out of World War I, essentially surrendering to Germany. And this is the end of the Eastern Front. So the Eastern Front began here. And ended here. Began around the same time Austria-Hungary invaded Serbia. Within a couple of days, all of that war was declared, and it ended with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. While Germany succeeded in this treaty on the Eastern Front in defeating Russia, they were losing on the Western Front. And they finally surrendered on the Western Front, November 11 of 1918, Armistice Day. So here you see Germany victorious, but the war on the Western Front is still ongoing, and on the 11th of November 1918, they surrendered. This abrogated the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Russia regained all that they had lost. The Bolshevik legislature on the 13th of November 1918 annulled the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. In the year after the armistice, following a timetable set by the victors, the Germany withdrew its occupying forces from all the lands that Germany had gained through this Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March. So this was the surrender of Germany. But when this peace was made, remember this is the First World War, did people really realise the extent to which they had lost? It's widely suggested that they did not actually even realise that they had lost the war. They didn't realise the extent to which Germany had lost until the Treaty of Versailles of 1919. They thought they could still negotiate their way out of it, that somehow it had been an inconclusive war, not a final defeat for Germany. And so this war did not officially end until 1919 with the Treaty of Versailles. And the shock within Germany at the harshness of this treaty was a direct cause of World War II. Hitler was able to use this affair to create conspiracy theories about how the country had been stabbed in the back and treated unfairly. But this Treaty of Versailles, one of the reasons it was able to be so harsh is the victors of World War I were able to point to Germany and show them just how hard Germany had made it on Russia at the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. So they used this treaty as an excuse to make harsh terms for Germany in Versailles. Quoting now from America's library, government website, World War I was finally over, the Treaty of Versailles. This first global conflict had claimed 9 million to 13 million lives and caused unprecedented damage. Germany had formally surrendered on November 11 of 1918, and all nations had agreed to stop fighting while the terms of peace were negotiated. So Germany still thinks it has some clout. June 28 of 1919, Germany and the Allied nations signed the Treaty of Versailles, formally ending World War I. So we find this progressive for until the official end. Another principle that we take from the history of Pyrrhus and also from the counterfeit is understanding the history of an alpha. If we go into the history of 1899 to 1945, it's the alpha history of modern Babylon. And we did the same thing when we went through the history of Pyrrhus. Pyrrhus in Macedonia. In the history of Macedonia, how did it end for the king of the north? In that history, you see the defeat of the king of the north in the alpha history. In the history of Pyrrhus in Italy, the king of the north being Rome, how did it end for Rome? Victory. So when we come to the history of World War II, how did it end for Germany, the king of the north? Defeat. And when it comes to our history, the king of the north, victory. So we saw through the histories of Pyrrhus that an alpha history is one of defeat for the king of the north. We also understand that the history of World War I and World War II, this being part of the alpha history of modern Babylon. And being part of the alpha history of modern Babylon, it means that this alpha history is a history of failure and disappointment for the king of the north. That was established before we ever understood World War I, based on our understanding of Pyrrhus and World War II. This third Diadochi War is not an alpha history. The fourth Diadochi War was because of its connection to Pyrrhus. Pyrrhus having two lines. Pyrrhus had his campaign in Macedonia, which ended in failure for the king of the north, or Demetrius. Then he had his campaign out of Rome, which was success for the king of the north, or Rome. Sorry, his campaign out of Italy. Then we had Germany in World War II. This is Alpha, Omega. Alpha, Omega. Beginning, end, beginning, end. The beginning of Pyrrhus' history in Macedonia, failure for the king of the north. His end, success for the king of the north in Italy. So when we come to our time, this alpha history, you see now not Pyrrhus, now the king of the south being Russia, or in one context the Soviet Union as it expanded. We see in its alpha history it's fighting against Germany, and this is in Europe. And how did it end for Germany? Failure of the king of the north. So when we come to the Omega history, The King of the North now being the United States, it's success for the King of the North. Within this Alpha history, there's two wars. There's World War I and there's World War II. So when we understood World War II, we understood that it ended in defeat for Germany or failure, but then when we made application of this time, when it came down into those battles between North and South, you had to flip it within application. It's the same thing when we discuss Millerite history. When we discuss the history of the counterfeit, it's a second witness for the same principle. When we understand the counterfeit from 1899 to 1945, 1945 was disappointment and failure for the papacy. They had a mistake within their message. 1844 was disappointment and failure for the Millerites. They had a mistake in their message. The only reason God's people are doing all work now is because the Millerite history was one of failure. They didn't complete the work. The only reason you see the papacy active today is because they also made mistakes in the history of World War I and World War II. It ended in a disappointment and a failure. I state this now so that when we make application of World War I, we know its context. And its context is as part of a history, of an Alpha history of failure. The same cannot be said for the Third Diadochi War, because in the history of Pyrrhus we had two histories, Macedonia and Italy. The Fourth Diadochi War being part of this Macedonian history. But this Third Diadochi War stands alone. It's not an Alpha or an Omega, which is why we only have the three lines overlapped. It's a history that stands on its own, but it gives us directly World War I, and we'll make application of it. So in our application, which we've already begun to discuss, I'll go back to the Third Diadochi War and remind us of this history. You have the Battle of Gabini, Antigonus versus Eumenes, two superpowers. Antigonus defeats Eumenes from the inside through the taking of his baggage train. And we saw elephants enabled him to do that. So elephants essentially gave Antigonus the victory, because it was the fighting of the elephants that enabled him to sneak behind and take the baggage train. And elephants become relevant because in the study of Pyrrhus and really the Alpha and the Omega histories of Pyrrhus, we find that at every relevant battle you find elephants. So this shows us we find the same mode of warfare in 1989 to 91, the same mode of warfare that we see at all the subsequent waymarks illustrated by a battle. We have a consistent mode of warfare. And the mode of warfare being illustrated in 1989 to 91 really is the culmination of the Cold War. Is what type of warfare? It's an information war. Through subterfuge, through information, and also through proxy wars. So any type of open warfare that you see in this history is essentially proxy wars, but the superpowers themselves only fight through strategy, through information. And in previous studies we've shown the big bang of the information age, the development of the World Wide Web from 1989 to 91, and how that has also changed information warfare. But it's the same type of warfare. And that impacts our application as well. Afghanistan, open war, but it's a proxy war. It's not the Soviet Union and the United States fighting directly. Antigonus defeats Eumenes. The United States defeated the Soviet Union. Antigonus became the master of Asia, or the lone superpower, the same way the United States here became a unilateral superpower. Antigonus rejected globalism, which was what the other allies wanted, the same way the United States rejected globalism under Reagan and George Bush Sr. Quoting George Bush Sr., "There's no substitute for American leadership." They immediately acted upon that with their behaviour in the Gulf War with Iraq. And we went into that history. We see in the Battle of Gabini and in the prior war, Antigonus has had two allies, Seleucus and Python. The United States had two key allies, the Vatican in Eastern Europe and the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. It's the Python, the Mujahideen, who are actively in the service, fighting on behalf of the King of the North. We see Python start to build up a power base that Antigonus finds to be a threat. The Mujahideen formed the Taliban, took over the majority of Afghanistan and the government in 1996. The United States starts to see them as a threat. I want to read some quotes regarding this history. The United States sees the Taliban as a threat. In 2001, they invade Afghanistan, overthrow the Taliban, and we marked that first conflict November 9 of 2001. I just want to read a couple of quotes about this history regarding the United States alliance with John Paul II, or Antigonus with Seleucus, the parallel of that. A couple of quotes from this early history with John Paul. This quote is from April 1st, 1991, and it's John Paul's response to the Gulf War. John Paul II delivered a scathing denunciation of the Persian Gulf War today, calling it a darkness that he said had cast a shadow over the whole human community. A choice was made of aggression and the violation of international law when it was presumed to solve the tensions between the peoples by war, the sower of death, he said in his Easter Sunday message to the city and the world. Throughout the Gulf War, John Paul made his opposition abundantly plain, and several times the Vatican expressed frustration over the futility of the papal appeals for peace. So it's directly, straight after the fall of the Berlin Wall, as the Soviet Union is crumbling, so is the alliance between between the papacy and the United States. And a key element of that was the fact that as the United States began to act as a sole superpower, they no longer needed any alliance with the papacy. And this crumbling continued through the Gulf War. As Eastern Europe turned to the West and democracy, John Paul became what he was known in that history as the angry Pope. And he was angry not just at the Gulf War and the United States failing to treat him as an equal ally, but also that those countries of Eastern Europe were turning to democracy rather than stronger Catholic leadership. And he ended up saying that democracy and capitalism were essentially just as bad or almost as bad as communism itself. And he was angry at how the affairs of Eastern Europe itself turned out. Then we find him in the history of the war in Afghanistan. And John Paul there says that only terrorists, not entire nations, should be called to account. So he opposed the war in Afghanistan. And then when it came into the war in Iraq, he expressed his strongest opposition yet. He described it as a defeat for humanity. No to war, the Pope said during his annual address to scores of diplomatic emissaries to the Vatican, an exhortation that referred in part to Iraq, a country that he mentioned in his speech twice. In opposing the Iraq war, John Paul sent top envoys to both President Bush and Saddam Hussein and made many public appeals for a diplomatic agreement. Barely audible but with the clear intent of frail John Paul II today, called for the speedy return of Iraqi sovereignty as he met President George Bush in the Vatican. This is 2004. The 84-year-old pontiff, an opponent of the US-led war in Iraq, sat alongside the president as he delivered the speech. The two had come from an earlier private meeting where an aide said the Pope had one or two things to say to Mr. Bush about war and peace. It is the evident desire, quoting John Paul, it is the evident desire of everyone that this situation now be normalised as quickly as possible, with the active participation of the international community and in particular the United Nations Organisation, in order to ensure a speedy return of Iraq's sovereignty in conditions of security for all its people. So between the Gulf War, the Afghanistan War and the Iraq War, John Paul had immediately gone into conflict with the United States, plus the affairs of Eastern Europe not going as he had intended. So that alliance crumbles. Do you find in that history is actually on the same side as, particularly when it comes to the Iraq War, is on the same side as Vladimir Putin, as we'll see in a moment. As John Paul II turned on the United States, so in this history of 2003 did three other former allies. We connected the Bosnian crisis. I won't repeat that. We see how Serbia and Bosnia typified Iraq and Kuwait, and that they were just spheres of influence of two bigger powers. We saw how this led to a terrorist attack, so we connected to 2001, not just this Afghanistan war, but behind it, this terrorist attack. So we've brought down both histories. We've brought down the war in Afghanistan, the 9/11 terrorist attack, both connecting to World War I. Now we find we have two ultimatums to connect. In the history of 2003, the United States wants to invade Iraq. They have sent an ultimatum to Iraq. Throughout this history, there's actually been quite a few ultimatums, and much of the world thinks that Iraq has actually fulfilled enough of those ultimatums to at least avoid imminent war. Three former allies of the United States band together, and they send an ultimatum to the United States, and they tell George Bush that if he tries to go to war with Iraq, they'll block it through the UN. Those three allies being France, Britain, and Russia. In this history, it's three allies that go to Antigonus and say, stop acting unilaterally and overthrowing whoever gets in your way. You have to work with us, share the power and the wealth you've accumulated. Antigonus refuses to do that. In this history, you see three allies, France, Britain and Russia, through the UN, tell the United States that if they try and attempt a war with Iraq, that they will block that war through the UN. We see an ultimatum. Another ultimatum, we see Austria-Hungary send an ultimatum to Serbia. And we also saw the United States send an ultimatum to Saddam Hussein. There was a series of ultimatums regarding allowing in weapons inspectors and releasing weapons. Some of those have been complied with, but increasingly not. Still, the majority of the world didn't see war as necessary at that point in time. And they send this final ultimatum that orders Saddam Hussein to leave the country along with his sons in a 24-hour period, or they will invade Iraq. So there's this final harsh ultimatum that Saddam Hussein will not cave to. So he's caved to some, but not all. Quoting from The Guardian in 2003, France, Russia and Germany yesterday raised the stakes in their defiance of Washington's war plans against Iraq, vowing jointly not to allow a resolution authorising war to be passed by the UN Security Council. At a hastily convened meeting in Paris, the three foreign ministers of the anti-war axes hardened their stance against military action and in favour of inspections 2 days before the UN Chief Weapons Inspector is due to report to the Security Council. Quoting the French Foreign Minister, "We will not allow the passage of a planned resolution that would authorise the use of force." He refused to say whether France was prepared to use its veto to block a new resolution already tabled by Britain, the US and Spain that would give the green light to the use of force against Baghdad. But he said, Russia and France, as permanent Security Council members, will fully assume all their responsibilities on this point. We are totally on the same line on this as the Russians. So you see, France, Britain and Russia, all on the same line, opposing any war with Iraq. Breaking international law, the United States invaded Iraq anyway, bypassing the UN Security Council. When Antigonus refused the ultimatum of the three allies, his response to that was to invade Ptolemy's sphere of influence. And who is Ptolemy? In our lines, who is he most associated with? King of the South. So Ptolemy is acting as the king of the South in this history. When Antigonus invades Coal Syria particularly, and some of the regions surrounding, but you can summarise it by Coal Syria. When Antigonus invades Coal Syria, he's invading the sphere of influence of Ptolemy. When the United States attacked Iraq, they attacked the sphere of influence of Russia. And I want to explain that a little more. Just quoting again the UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, he declared explicitly that the US-led war on Iraq was illegal. He was asked outright in an interview with the BBC if the war was illegal, and he said, yes, if you wish. He then added unequivocally, I've indicated it was not in conformity with the UN Charter. From our point of view and from the Charter point of view, it was illegal. I just want to give some evidence for the connection or the alliance between Iraq and Russia. Most discussions of Russian interests in Iraq focus on economic factors. Moscow, however, has cultivated friendly relations with Baghdad since the 1960s as part of its general strategy toward the region in connection with the Arab-Israeli conflict and the broader Cold War. The Soviet Union was Saddam's main arms supplier during Iraq's war with Iran that we discussed before. Russia still perceives itself as having strategic interests and an historic role in that region and does not want to be seen as betraying a longtime friend. Many observers believe that Russian policy is also motivated by a desire to restrain US global domination and rein in perceived US tendencies towards unilateralism and excessive reliance on military force. The idea of a multipolar world not totally dominated by a single hyperpower in which Russia would be a major international player still has strong appeal in Russia. Thus, Russia may have had an interest in principle in opposing unilateral US military action in Iraq. Putin does not seek to project Russia into the forefront of an anti-American coalition. He seeks, in cooperation with traditional US allies France and Germany, as well as with Russian partners such as China, to put some limits on US power, especially its recourse to unilateral military force. This is a CRS report. In February 2003, Russian opposition to US military action against Iraq hardened. Putin travelled to Berlin and Paris and joined French President and the German Chancellor in a joint declaration stating that there was still an alternative to war and that Russia, France and Germany were determined to work together to complete disarmament in Iraq peaceably. I've put Britain here. I think that was Germany, sorry. France, Germany, Russia. On March 2, Putin rejected regime change as a legitimate goal in Iraq. Quoting Putin, "The international community cannot interfere with the domestic affairs of any country in order to change its regime. The only legitimate goal the UN can pursue in this situation is the disarmament of Iraq." On March 10, the Foreign Minister Ivanov declared that if the US-backed resolution authorising war was submitted to the UNSH, the UN Security Council, Russia would vote against it. There are probable multiple factors behind Putin's more hardline stance toward the United States. There is Russia's interest in promoting a multipolar world and bolstering the stature and authority of the UN or Russia as opposed to the US itself. What came out a number of years after the Iraq War was that in the early days, just prior to the US invasion and just after the US invasion, the Russian government collected intelligence sources from inside the American military command and fed them through to Saddam Hussein. They fed through to Saddam information on the US plans and on US troop movements. This is from The Independent. The Russians relayed information to Saddam during the opening days of the war in late March and early April 2003, including a crucial time before the ground assault on Baghdad. So in the early days of the war, Russia was funneling information, secret information about US plans through to Saddam. If you've followed some of the documentaries that have been shared through this year, they highlight this war in Iraq as being a crucial turning point in Vladimir Putin's plans. It's in this history of the Iraq War that he goes from a position of being willing to work with George Bush and the West to essentially being in direct opposition. He changes his whole behaviour and mindset in the history around the Iraq War. And you can compare his behaviour before the Iraq War to his behaviour afterwards. He says in 2007, if you watch those documentaries, that due to the behaviour of the United States and this behaviour of regime change, that no one feels safe. And he says that in an extremely aggressive and emphatic fashion. I would suggest, as we look at war in our time, on two fronts, Eastern and Western front, what we've done is we've seen through the history of World War II that we come to 2016 and we see a battle and we see a war beginning on the Western front, but I want to focus on the Eastern front because the Western front we know as being the internal polarisation within the West and those conflicts, but I want to focus on the Eastern. We see in 2019 what we've expected to see and what we've taught from October last year, that there is to be the eastern front of this war between the United States and Russia. It's an information war, and they're fighting over spheres of influence. And as we've taught this throughout the year, it's been apparent that if we're going to define that war in our time as being an information war over spheres of influence, then what about 2014 and the invasion of Ukraine? What about all that history previous? Because the United States and Russia have already been in an information war and they've already been fighting over spheres of influence. And I would suggest, as you see Russia emerge as a global superpower after the fall of the Soviet Union, that it's in the history of the Iraq War that we see World War III begin. It's in this history, with the invasion of the sphere of influence of Russia, as we see Antigonus invade the sphere of influence of Ptolemy, that this begins to escalate. Between Russia and the United States. You can go back into history and see how Vladimir Putin responded to that Iraq war. Even when he invades Ukraine and he's attacked for that, people say you broke international law, you invaded Ukraine, and his general response is, yeah, but Iraq. you do the same thing. So he certainly hasn't forgotten the behaviour of the United States in 2003. We talked before about that 25-year gap in our application of World War II. It does not fill in the history between the fall of the Soviet Union and 2014. What World War I and the Third Diadochi War do is they begin to fill in this gap. We see how the Gulf War led to this conflict. We see how it led to Afghanistan, this terrorism issue with the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. We see how it led to this ultimatum, how there's two ultimatums between the three allies against the King of the North and also against the King of the North and his opponent. The three allies, France, Germany and Russia, against the United States, and also the United States against Saddam Hussein. This developed into the United States attacking the sphere of influence of the King of the South. Iraq 2003 in application. This is when both fronts of that war develop. Internal polarisation in the West, also the Eastern Front turning Vladimir Putin more and more against the United States. So what Vladimir Putin needs, remember, now we're into the history of war, and this is a history of failure. So what do we have to do? It all starts to get switched. This is failure for the King of the North. This is success for the King of the North. So you have to start switching. The King of the North comes up with a plan to end the war on the Eastern Front by taking a revolutionary, sending him through to overthrow the government in Russia. We flip that. How does the King of the South, how does Vladimir Putin want to bring an end to the war on the Eastern Front? This Eastern Front having continued from 2003 with Yemen, with Libya, with Ukraine, with Syria, all of these countries where they're fighting over spheres of influence, how is he going to bring that to an end? You take someone, a revolutionary, who says that they're going to end this conflict between Russia and the United States, and you send them through to the United States to overthrow the government. His man of choice was Donald Trump. Through German intervention, Lenin went in and overthrew that government. November 8 of 2016, Donald Trump wins the US election. Announced November 9, declared November 9, the vote November 8. Hence the use of the two votes. But the vote November 8, Donald Trump wins the US election, and he has been aided in that victory, directly aided by the King of the South. Lenin overthrew the government of Germany, directly aided by the King of the North, with the promise to bring peace. This is where we have lined up 2019. And this is where we see we do this a few times in prophecy and it always fits and it's always neat, but it sounds dangerous. We see two things that look like they are complete contradictions. We would say that at Raphia, there's a battle. At Raphia there is a battle, and if we were to just take this from World War II, from our other application, it would mark the beginning of the Eastern Front here. This marks the end of it. And when you see this invasion, in World War II it would say that this was the Operation Barbarossa, the beginning of the Eastern Front. It would say that at this point there is the beginning of war. So World War II says that in 2019 the war between Russia and the United States begins. World War I says in 2019 the war between Russia and the United States ends. So you have two seemingly opposite descriptions of what was to take place this year. One says war, one says peace. And they seem contradictory, but I want to suggest that they're not, and it's actually quite perfect depending on which perspective you want to take it from. So World War I is going to give you the history of conflict from 2003 to 2019. And we could go into this history and we could discuss Libya, Gaddafi, how that went down between Russia and the United States, or Yemen, which is still ongoing, Ukraine, Syria, beginning from 2011. They've wrestled over these spheres of influence all through this time. And now we come to this history, and World War I says this is where there's peace. It's all come to an end because Donald Trump has come into the United States, he's overthrown the government, now peace has been declared, and now he's going to act on that peace and properly stop these conflicts over spheres of influence. I would suggest that we've actually seen that fulfilled. World War II comes in and it says there's peace in this history because you see Hitler, Stalin go into an alliance, they're working together, there's trade agreements, and that here is where the Eastern Front begins. So this is World War I. The Eastern Front of World War I. This is the Eastern Front of World War II. And the reason I would suggest that this still fits perfectly is because what does peace look like? Peace is defeat. There may be peace declared here, but the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was a clear defeat for Russia. They lost their sphere of influence. The same way as Operation Barbarossa, when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, he took over their spheres of influence. It was the beginning of stage 2 of the conflict. World War I Eastern Front, World War II Eastern Front. And you have this waymark dividing the two histories where it looks like peace, but is in reality a defeat. In the history of failure, it's a defeat for the King of the South. Flip it. In the history of success, it's a defeat for the King of the North. But we know that we're now entering into the second phase of war on the Eastern Front. This being given to us by World War I, this being given to us by World War II. And it shouldn't come as a surprise that the Western Front has continued throughout all of this history, which we see every time we turn on our news. So we see at the Battle of Gaza, the defeat of the King of the North by the King of the South. And we come down here, we see the defeat of the King of the North, the United States, by Russia. We understand that it's a conflict over spheres of influence, and we understand that in World War I it's symbolised by this peace treaty. But we know how this conflict ends, and we know that it ends with the defeat of the King of the South at Panium. Just so Russia surrendered to Germany here, but Germany was facing a war on the Western Front, and they were also being worn down with that war. And so on Armistice Day 1918, Germany surrenders. So we know at Panium there is the defeat of the King of the South. It's that Western Front that wears down Germany. But when that Western Front comes to a resolution, it automatically absolves, it fixes this prior defeat. When Germany surrenders here, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk is dissolved. So Russia's victories here in these spheres of influence, we already expect to be undone in the history of Panium. USA would defeat the Soviet Union. And the conflict all through is spheres of influence. What we begin to connect with in this history that needs to be dealt with in further presentations that we won't go into now is exactly how we see the rise of the papacy in this history. You see Seleucus back in this history allied to Antigonus, but that alliance dissolves. In this history, John Paul II, or the papacy, allied to the United States. But that alliance quickly dissolves, and in this history you have Francis come up. And who is Francis more friendly with, Trump or Putin? Visibly more friendly with Putin. He grew up in Argentina. He grew up with essentially socialism, and is known to have those tendencies. And you have an alliance that has turned from the United States to a closer friendship actually with the King of the South and with Russia. And through this conflict, you see Seleucus begin to take back power. So from Panium through to the Sunday Law, I would suggest you begin to see the rise of the papacy. Although we need to refine what that looks like. This already being evidenced by the 273 that took us to the history of Pyrrhus, when you see the alliance that starts to be created between Egypt and Rome. But through this conflict, Seleucus, symbolising the papacy, begins to become more and more politically established, all of which leads to the Sunday Law. And as we've said in our prior studies, the fall of the King of the South begins at Panium, but it is not formally completed until Sunday Law. It's a progressive fall. We see that when we overlay 1989 with Panium and 1991 with Sunday Law. 1989, King of the South defeated. Progressive fall until the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. Same thing here, 1918, Germany surrenders, Armistice Day. Progressive fall until the Treaty of Versailles, where it's formalised. It's the same pattern. In closing, I know that we're out of time. We know in the history of 2003, this tensions developed where Vladimir Putin decided in a stronger and stronger fashion he was not going to let the United States conduct regime change in territories under his control, under Vladimir Putin's authority. He's held to that most firmly within Syria. And these conflicts, the two key conflicts in this history that have developed between the United States and Russia have all centred around Syria and Ukraine. Both of which you can particularly mark in 2014. So when we come to this waymark of Raphia 2019, you know what they're fighting over is Syria and Ukraine. And what World War I gave us, as it opened up in around August and September of this year, that what we were to expect in 2019 was a battle, was a defeat for the United States, but at the same time that is a correct understanding. It also looks like a peace being made. The end of this ongoing war over spheres of influence, particularly Syria and Ukraine. And I would like to highlight what has happened in the last few weeks. This is the New York Times, November 12, 2019. It's titled, "Russia's Comeback Isn't Stopping with Syria." For many in the West, Russia's return to the world stage over the past few years, they're highlighting 5 years, 14 to 19, our dispensation, has come as a surprise, and not an especially pleasant one. After the downfall of the Soviet Union, the country was written off as a regional power, a filling station masquerading as a state. 5 years later, however, Russia is still resilient, despite the Western sanctions imposed over its actions in Ukraine. It has effectively won militarily in Syria. Today it is a power broker in that country. The victory has raised its prestige in the Middle East and provided material support for Moscow's claims to be a great power again. It's not just within Syria, also within Ukraine over the impeachment scandal. It's taken back its authority in Ukraine as Vladimir Putin has publicly evidenced his lack of support for the Ukrainian government. Russia's achievements in the Middle East go way beyond the success in Syria proper. Moscow benefits from its alliances with Turkey and Iran, with Saudi Arabia, or recent arrangements with Saudi Arabia, new military ties with Egypt. It is again a player of some consequence in Libya, a power to which many Lebanese look to help them hold their country together, a would-be security broker between Iran and the Gulf states, all while maintaining an intimate relationship with Israel. So it's bigger than just Syria, it's how it's impacted the whole of the Middle East. It has just in the last few weeks sent troops into the civil war in Yemen, now with Russian mercenaries fighting against the UN coalition within Libya. It's flown into Africa and started to form coalitions within Africa. But it particularly centres around the spheres of Syria and Ukraine. And we've seen that perfectly fulfilled, particularly in the last few weeks, the last month gone by. How that has developed favourably towards Russia and Vladimir Putin, and seemingly how this conflict between Russia and the United States in those territories has come to an end. There's another article by the ABC News. Who reaps the rewards of Donald Trump's chaos in Syria and Ukraine? Spoiler alert, it's Vladimir Putin. It's been well publicised how these events have been a victory, much needed strategic victory for Vladimir Putin. We're out of time, so we won't go into the developments in Africa and Yemen. But if we just focused on Syria and Ukraine, you can see how Donald Trump's actions in the last few weeks have been, as these news stories highlight, a strategic victory for Russia. But we know that this is the ending of phase 1 of the Eastern Front, and that there is a second phase that here begins. Our last point before we close is, as we discussed World War II, we were able to see that Donald Trump fulfilled many of the characteristics of Hitler. And I don't just mean that to be mean or to sound something ugly like he's Hitler. He literally, in many ways, fulfills that characteristics. The way Hitler used propaganda and a cult of personality, how he campaigned, his rallies, all have close similarities to how Donald Trump conducts himself, particularly through Twitter and through other avenues. But what I want us to also see is how close he is to Kaiser Wilhelm. The characteristics with Kaiser Wilhelm, a separate line, separate to this, if we were to look at 1890, you have a power player in Germany, Bismarck, who'd united all the German states, formed the German Empire, defeated France. He held off World War I through his network of alliances. And in 1890, a young Kaiser with limited experience pushes Bismarck out of government. This was another cause of World War I. Kaiser Wilhelm pushes Bismarck out of government because he doesn't want anyone taking authority or power from him. Pushes Bismarck out, takes over the German government solely, and starts to unravel all of the alliances Bismarck had created to hold war at bay. And one of the reasons that Kaiser Wilhelm thought he didn't need alliances with allies to keep war at bay is because he had a particular thought. First of all, he was extremely nationalistic. He wanted Germany to have a, quote, place in the sun. but he also believed that he could keep Germany at peace through his personal rule, through his personal relationships with other world leaders. I'm quoting here from a YouTube series known as The Great War, this one being titled Kaiser Wilhelm. In 1888, Kaiser Wilhelm became the king. In 1890, he pushed Bismarck out of government, and he began to meddle personally in Germany's foreign policy, all on the basis of his emotions. So what characterized Kaiser Wilhelm in history is that he enacted foreign policy based on his emotions, resulting in incoherence and inconsistency in Germany's relationship with other countries. He also made public blunders that humiliated Germany in world standing. And third, he believed that he could keep peace through his relationships, through his personal relationships with other world leaders, which is the exact same way we see Trump reacting today. His personal relationship with world leaders, he believes, is enough to prevent war. He doesn't need allies. If he gets on with Kim Jong-un and he thinks that they're friends, that's enough to keep peace. 1890 being the 126 to 2019, and 2016, you find someone who had kept peace through alliances to someone who enacts foreign policy based on his emotions, makes serious public blunders that impacts the United States on the world stage, and also believes that he can keep peace through personal relationships. For Donald Trump, all is personal. So just as we went to World War II and saw the connection between Adolf Hitler and Donald Trump, the nationalism, the racism, the cult of personality, you also connect it to World War I and see Kaiser Wilhelm, his personality and how he enacted foreign policy. This is a repeat of what has been, what was studied in Germany. One of the reasons we repeated it is because we wanted to remind people of where we are in history. With the shaking and the conflict that's gone on, we've lost some. The fear was that many people were not paying proper attention to what is happening externally, and they're missing key important events. People say nothing much has happened. How many impeachments have there been in US history? Not very many. And I would suggest that the one we see now is extraordinary. We are in extraordinary times, and we cannot come down from our tower. We can't come down from being watchmen and just engage in conflict with each other, with our former brethren. We need to keep on track and remember what these lines were opened up to teach us. They only opened up, these lines particularly, around the middle of this year. And they opened up at that time to give us a greater understanding of what we were to expect between Russia and the United States. Many of those expectations already fulfilled. We have to be watching these external events, and if we haven't been watching, we need to go back and catch up. But I do want to remind us, now that we have looked at these events, just what the other alternative is. When those opposing this message left the movement, Elder Jeff said that he believed our lines, he believed the lines, he didn't accept the application. Even before he said that, the minute I knew they were leaving this movement, I did say in Germany, in the German conference, that as they started to reject this message, they were going to find themselves, those who left this movement, in a more and more untenable position. We have had information increasing in this dispensation from 2014 that tells us directly where we are in history. And we come to this history, and just as prophetically illustrated and expected, there is a shaking and a division between those who accept the third angel's message and those who do not accept the third angel's message. And I stated in the German conference that as they rejected this message, they would be forced to backtrack. And they would be forced to destroy the truths laid out in this history until they had no anchor except for 9/11. The reason I joined this movement is because I went to an Adventist church, various Adventist churches, and soon realized that they have no understanding of where the world is prophetically after 1888. That's over 130 years where Adventism cannot give an explanation of 2 world wars, of the conflict happening today, and of anything in between. That is what this movement, one of the reasons this movement is here, one of the reasons that we were raised up is to give a prophetic explanation of where we are in world history. And Adventism cannot do that. They're over 130 years behind in understanding what is happening externally, which is why they have no idea what Trump is or what is happening. And many siding with him because they cannot have the visibility to see that church and state are combining under Donald Trump. The exact same thing happens to people who leave this movement. As these truths are rejected, now we come down, it's November 16, 2019. Elder Jeff has said that Theodore was the one who came up with the date of November 9. They have deleted all of the videos off YouTube that were done last October, all the videos that laid out World War II and the Diadochi Wars and Pyrrhus. The position they find themselves in is with no prophetic explanation for anything subsequent to 9/11. Worse than that, they've started moving the second angel. Once they move the second angel, they've lost 9/11 itself. But I would ask, if they lay claim to understanding 2019 and they say that they were the ones that came up with this date, where is their explanation for it? Because they do not accept the lines that have been laid out by the Midnight Cry message. And if they reject those lines, the only alternative is they have to go back to their original position. Their original position was where they could not explain anything between Russia and the United States throughout this history. They could not explain the Iraq War. They could not explain 2014 or Ukraine or Syria. They need to go back to their original explanation of war as being a hot war. They need to go back to saying that sometime in this history there's going to be a hot war between Russia and the United States. They won't do that. They can't do that because it's already too late and there's been no hot war. They've played a game of Jenga and they don't realise just how much they've lost. Without the message they're rejecting, they cannot explain any of this. They cannot explain this year, even while they claim to be the ones who brought this year to the movement. The challenge that people face who leave the movement is they have no prophetic eyesight of where we are. And the reason that they don't have any eyesight is because they've returned to the Laodicean condition of Adventism, which is a rejection of a prophetic message. Just as Adventism doesn't have a prophetic understanding, neither does FFA or Elder Jeff. It's only through these lines and the Midnight Cry message that we can come to Raphia and understand what it is and what happened. And connected to that, only through that understanding have we been able to explain this conflict between Russia and the United States all the way from 1989 forward. These lines are powerful. They have nothing to teach us. FFA has nothing to teach their own people now, other than concepts of some type of a strike in Nashville. But they have no lines to explain where we are in Earth's history or what is happening between Russia and the United States. These lines are powerful, and I would encourage everyone who remains in this movement, if you've been distracted from following the external events, go back and catch up, however long that takes, to see what has happened these last months within the papacy, with the Amazonian Synod, within Syria, within the impeachment, within Ukraine, within Africa, and within Yemen. And for those that have left this movement, give a prophetic explanation or accept this one. If you kneel with me, we'll close in prayer. Dear Father in heaven, thank you for our blessings. Thank you, Lord, that you wish to educate your people. Lord, we know the Laodicean condition. It's not moral, but a loss of a prophetic understanding of where we are and what we must be as a people. Lord, I pray that we'll have our prophetic understanding. We know that you still have more to teach us, but may we in no way doubt your leading in the past. I pray, Lord, that as these lines are laid out, as we remember the lines that have been laid out over the last years, that we'll feel stronger and more established, that this movement has built its house upon the rock. When the shaking comes, Lord, it cannot be swept away because these lines are our rock. And we understand, Lord, that you have established us on a prophetic message with a prophetic methodology that will not shake us when storms come. I pray, Lord, for those being shaken. For different reasons, they haven't been able to watch. And some of them just have neglected. I pray, Lord, that those that are still in the valley of decision, Father, may they realize the danger of their position. May they see the strength of the lions. May they see, Lord, that you do not bring us to such a time without a prophetic explanation, a prophetic eyesight of where we are in world history. Please prepare us for the times that are coming. We know that while in one sense this is a conclusion of a matter, that it's also the beginning, that we have not just the methodology of cutting our lines, but of progression, and with progression things will only escalate more and more. I pray that you'll prepare us for that, both in heart and in mind. Thank you, Lord, that we can come together as a group and study these things. I pray, Lord, for more and more eyesight as to where we are. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.